All he wanted was a little downtime, a little time for recharging, to connect with his God. Twice now Jesus has tried to withdraw and downshift as his world has changed. So the backstory, we've heard about the feeding of the 1,000, which actually was more like 10,000 when you include the women and the children, right? You start with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and it feeds a whole lot of people. A little bit further back in the scripture, Jesus has just learned that his cousin has been beheaded by the spineless Herod, and he needs a little bit of time. He's tried now twice to get away from the crowds. His demands as his role as healer and teacher are challenging. And then trying to lead his work group, the disciples, also has his moments of stress and joy to remind them that God is doing a new thing, to lead his work group into that newness of letting go of what was, of constantly pointing them towards a God who loves them and desires liberation for them. It's that relentless work as a leader, right? Putting the mission and ministry before the crew so that we can build that more just and generous world. And finally, Jesus has everybody fed. He's got the disciples on the boat. They're on the other side of the lake. He's been able to dismiss the crowd. He's turned off the ringtone, and he's able to go up to the mountain to pray, to be by himself, to be replenished and held by his God who names and claims him, as we did over and over again, reminding of us our true identity, beloved children of God, deserving love and respect, and God uses us to change this world for good. We remembered that mystery of the water and that dove that alighted Jesus, reminding him that he was going to be that person of peace. So there's Jesus needing that rest, that God-ordained rest and renewal and Sabbath, that time to recharge. Don't you just want to linger in that place? That place of pause, that place of rest, that prayerful connection with God. And I know that y'all pray in many different ways. We did Statio today. We can do some movement just to really wake us up, right? Or the journaling, or the dream work, or the dance that you do. Don't you just linger to curl up in the bow of the boat with Jesus on those calm waters, to be safe and snuggled in? It reminds us of the scene in the musical Hamilton. How many of you have been? Remind me. If not, please YouTube it, yes, when you leave. And it's the Obama White House YouTube video that just is fantastic. It's the song One Last Time, How to Say Goodbye. And do y'all remember a time when we didn't have those phones in our hands? Prior to 2007, do y'all remember that? The electronic leash? Oh, you can remember that, huh? Yes, talk about a changing world that we live in. So the scene in Hamilton is Alexander Hamilton is meeting with George Washington. George Washington is stepping down from being president. And George Washington starts singing about Scripture telling us that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. He talks about that rhythm between justice and rest, justice and rest. It's what we're creating. And Washington says, I want to sit under my own vine and fig tree, a moment alone in the shade. I want that moment of rest. I want that moment of pause so that we can not just survive and yet thrive, because we're not hardwired for the pace that we are currently living in. We talked last week as we launched this new worship theme, Ready for a Change, and I know we're Minnesotans, but Ready for a Change based on Tom Friedman's book. Y'all read it, right? If not, I hope you check it out. Thank you for being late. An Optimist Guide to Thriving in the Age of Accelerations. We are experiencing the increase in technology, globalization, and climate change. It's the winds and waves of change, and they're happening at a rapid pace. And this is what they're resulting in. The flow of information and knowledge are making the world not only interconnected and hyper-connected, but interdependent. Everyone, Friedman says, is now more vulnerable to the actions of anyone, anywhere. Dr. King knew about this when he sat in a Birmingham jail as he was doing some protesting, and he was writing to the clergy of his day who kept telling him, Martin, you're going too fast. You need to slow down. It's not time yet. It's not time yet for your liberation. It's not time yet. And Martin said, in a real sense, all of the world is interrelated. All of us are caught in that inescapable network of mutuality, tied in that single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. He says this is the interrelated structure of reality. And yet if reality is changing so quick, we are experiencing that dislocation, that dizziness of how am I ever going to keep up? This is what's happening now. So much of our worlds are changing and our institutions are changing, and we're having a hard time staying on top of it. And so then how do we respond, church? How do we respond? I've been thinking about a man from my former congregation who came into my office, and he had been battered by the winds of change and those waves. He was a CEO of a major corporation, a mover and shaker, and he came in and he said, Pastor Cynthia, I am exhausted. My energy is depleted. Every day I get over 1,000 emails. I said, how is that numerically possible? Even if you spent a minute, you all are smart folks, even if you spent a minute on every single email, that's a 16-hour day just on moving emails back and forth. He says, I have to organize and prioritize and flag and shuffle things into different boxes. I said, how is this sustainable? How are you going to keep up this pace? He says, I have a wife and 2 kids. I can't quit my job. I said, this is relentless. He said, yes, it's relentless. I said, what are we going to do? So we talked about the necessity of the pause. In church, we know about this. The necessity of the pause, and us be about a people who know about change. And the need to be deeply rooted, but not stuck. To be deeply rooted and not stuck. To learn what it means to become more agile together. To be clear about where we're rowing together. If you ever wonder why in the back of the bulletin we continue to include our vision statement and 3 priorities, it's to remind us. If you ever wonder during the Word of Welcome what I'm doing, it's to ground us more deeply in who we are, whose we are, and where we are rowing together. And here is an invitation. I hope you all have it marked on February 1st in the morning to come here. Reverend Dr. Michael Piazza, who made an announcement. Did you read that? Not yet in your bulletin? Yeah, he made the connection between beer and church. And anyone who make a connection about beer and church, don't you want to come here? About how we're going to thrive together as faithful people of God. How we're going to continue with our extravagant welcome from all of you in the pews now and those folks who are currently on their way. So the winds of change are blowing, the waves are happening. How then do we respond? Are y'all familiar with Eric Astroteller? He's a CEO of Google's X Research. His formal title is Captain of Moonshots. Wouldn't that be an awesome job? Every day you get to go into work, and every day with your team you produce moonshots, turning what other considered science fiction into products and services that transform how we live and work. Jesus knew about a moonshot, didn't he, when he walked out on that water? And you can have your I don't know, should we call it cynical? That has a bit of a harsh edge, doesn't it? Let's call it doubt. You can doubt if that actually happened. You can say, you know what that was, Pastor Cynthia? That was just a scribe having a little bit of fun when they were translating that scripture. It used to say walking in water, and they said, let's change this to an O. So you can go down that route. Or we can open ourselves to the possibility and the potentiality that maybe Jesus was expanding what can happen. Let's move out of the literalness, right, to the metaphoric and to the symbolic, right? Because you all know about what's possible. Could you remember watching the game? Did you all watch the Packers and the Seahawks? Talk about what's possible, right? And talk about what's possible. There we were, my son and I watching that game, rooting for, it's going to come as no surprise, the Seahawks, yes? But he had his phone with him, and we want to know who made more, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers. So my son talks to his friend Siri. Hey, Siri, Siri, who somehow in this little machine thinks a little bit. How in the world does she do that? And then she tells us who makes more. Talk about a changing world in which we live. That didn't happen 11 years ago when my son was born. Actually, he was right on the cusp of that fantastic technology that's happened. That's also a little creepy, right? Because is Siri also listening into the rest of the things that are going on while we're rooting for the team to win? So walking on water and the possibilities. You don't have to believe that that actually happens, but I hope that you'll go a little bit deeper this morning to the possibility of being deeply rooted and not stuck. How, beloved church, do we continue thriving personally and professionally and as a church living out the good mission God calls us to? By being deeply rooted and not stuck and learning how to be lifelong learners who adapt. I know a lot of us come to church. We have our pew that we sit in. We have our hymnal that we've used for a long time. We like things to be rather stable. We can have that. We can have that deeply rootedness and yet continue to be a people who are agile, who are willing to experiment with what it means to be faithful, with what it means to try on new ways of doing worship. Here's a shout out and a thank you to our fantastic diaconate ministry team who knows about the necessity of meaningful, memorable worship. If you can engage more than 2 of your senses, it's going to be memorable and meaningful. If we can have liturgical arts that help us go deeper in our worship theme, there's a possibility that you all get to grow in your spiritual transformation. It's what dynamic stability looks like. We're learning how to be more agile. We're learning how to experiment together, to be deeply rooted and not stuck. That captain of Moonshot says dynamic stability is this. There are some ways of being, like riding a bicycle, where you cannot stand still, but once you are moving, it is actually easier. It's not our natural state, he says, but we need to continue learning how to exist in this state. Y'all holding on to that tension? Dynamic stability. It's deeply rooted, but so when the winds blow, we are grounded in our God and willing to experiment with being more agile. So Jesus is out on that water, right? And in these anxiety-ridden times in which we live, Jesus comes to us doing the seemingly impossible. The disciples see Jesus walking towards them, and as our kids said so beautifully, they're terrified, right? They think it's a ghost. Yet Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. In the midst of changes that we are experiencing, in the midst of this accelerated time, right with us is our God, who will not leave us alone. And then there's Peter. And I think we need to be more like Peter. Because Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you to get on the water." So Jesus says, "Come." And Peter gets out of the boat. Rather than staying snugly warm, rather than staying stuck with what he knew was possible before, Peter has the courage to get out of the boat. He's willing to deeply be rooted in his trust and his love of Jesus, yet he's willing to experiment about what might be possible as he follows this Jesus. So he gets out of the boat. Rather than just saying, "Oh, yeah, I believe in that mission statement. I believe with Jesus anything's possible." Rather than just being that armchair quarterback, rather than just throwing rocks of criticism, Peter gets out of the boat. Peter gets out of the boat to follow his Jesus, and he too starts doing what we think is impossible. Something that wasn't even on his radar anymore as he experiments with this dynamic stability. And then he gets scared. Like many of us are in these days in which we live. He gets scared and he cries out to Jesus and he begins to sink and he says, "Lord, save me." And immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand. Immediately, not a half hour from now, not 2 days from now, but into that moment of fear, there is this Jesus offering his hand and lifts Peter back up. Right there in the moment, saving him. And he is caught. He is comforted in his fear. We at Lynnhurst are learning what it means to get out of the boat together, to experiment with being deeply rooted but not stuck, to experiment with being more agile with one another. Our mission team has asked for our feedback about where we want to invest our time and energy in this days in which we live. Our trustees are doing a fantastic job of taking care of this gorgeous aging building in a ways that means we get to continue being fantastic stewards. And our church leadership council is inviting us into engaging with a consultant about putting systems into place that help us thrive. But first, we have to get out of the boat. Right beside us is this Jesus. When we're terrified, in your personal lives, in your professional lives, being pushed about by the waves and the wind, and you feel like you're sinking, Jesus continues to reach out his hand to you to catch you. So let us be a people who are agile, who are deeply rooted but not stuck. Let us participate and learn what it means to have that dynamic stability, which means, of course, we have to get out of the boat. We ask, O God, for the courage and the strength to follow you now and always. Amen.